Hello, everyone. At Communitech, we are working hard to bring you business as virtual as much as possible while also supporting our members the best we can. Good afternoon to this session, and thanks for joining us today. My name is Armin Eichhorn. I'm a startup advisor with a focus on MedTech companies. And I'm very excited to have a number of great people join me today for a panel Ask Me Anything session on MedTech and how to become a successful MedTech founder. We have with me today Bruce Brown, who is the Vice President of Marketing at Kinoda and comes with many years of MedTech experience. Dr. Neil Naik, a family physician who works with a couple of startups here in the community, helping them move their business forward. Paul Weber, Managing Director at On Point Ventures, and also himself very distinguished in terms of experience in the MedTech sector, as well as Peter Bloch, who's the CEO of Brezotech. And along with Paul and Bruce, they are also Communitech Growth Coaches for MedTech companies. So I'm very excited to have them join us today. And before we kick things off, I did want to point out a couple other sessions that we have coming up. On Tuesday, November the 17th, next week, So You Want to Be a Unicorn, also from 2 to 3 p.m. And then the week after, Navigating Early Stage Investment in Kitchener-Waterloo and the Silicon Valley. Before we kick things off, just a few housekeeping items. A reminder that this session is being recorded, so it can be shared at a later date through our website, communitech.ca. You can find it there probably in a few weeks, along with all other AMA sessions that we've run so far and the next ones that are coming up. You might want to minimize your speaker view on the right-hand side of your screen in order to view the full presentation. And I would also ask that you keep your microphone on mute during the session. If you have any questions, please use the chat functionality to ask those. And we will get to questions if they slot in well during the presentation. Otherwise, we'll make sure afterwards to have some time to respond to the questions asked. If you are interested in asking a very specific question related to your company, or just generally diving deeper into how Communitech can help your MedTech startup succeed, you can either find some time with your Communitech advisor if you already have one, and otherwise you can reach out to myself. You might have gotten an email from me. This is maybe how you found this session. Otherwise, feel free to contact us via our general email and ask to be connected with Armin to receive MedTech support. Please also check out our newsletter, Your Week in Tech, and our Startup and Scale Up newsletters for a list of upcoming Ask Me Anything sessions. So with that, we're going to kick things off and dive into the unique nature of MedTech startups. And we would like to have a couple interactive elements here, not just the questions later on, but also get your input early on to understand who's in the room, what are some of your expectations. So if you want to grab your phone or a second screen and head over to menti.com right now and type in this code you see at the top of the screen, 3931643. A question will pop up that is asking at what stage of development your company's product or solution is. So if you want to respond to that, we're going to see the results here live. And just a note for those who might be watching the recording of this session, please also head to menti.com and follow these same steps. We are still looking into this data to understand who is watching the video and be better able to serve you. So we have the first responses coming in here, and I'm going to give you a little bit of time. So again, menti.com and type in the code 3931643. The first question will pop up, and then once you answer that, the next question is going to automatically show on your screen. You can already answer that. Please pause when you see a screen that says back to the presentation. So far we have a number of working prototype companies and some that are at different stages, either prior to that or later than that. So if you're still on the first question, feel free to take your time to respond to that. In the meantime, I'm going to see what we are seeing on the second question. Does your solution require regulatory approval by Health Canada or for the US market, the FDA? We see a relatively balanced split, a couple more no's than yeses, and some are still unsure. That's fine. That is exactly one of the things that we're going to talk about today. So while you're responding to that, just looking at the third question here, the next hour would be time well spent if, and we have the first responses coming in there, understanding regulatory needs for managing patient information, recommendation on QMS systems. So we will get to some of the questions during the session in the material that's presented and some of them afterwards. If your question wasn't answered, again, feel free to reach out to us via your advisor if you have one already, or contact myself directly, and we're going to be happily helping you. So while those answers are still coming in, I'll just give you maybe another 30 seconds or so to respond, and then we're going to start diving into the presentation content. Let's look back at the first two questions. We have more responses in. Looks like half the group here today is at the prototyping stage, so that's exciting. And then a couple of companies at different stages. And we have a slight majority of companies not requiring FDA approval. Quite a few also still looking for a better understanding of whether they require the approval. And we have more expectations coming in terms of what would be time well spent for the next hours. So that's looking great. Again, if you're still responding, feel free to do that. In the meantime, I'm gonna head back to the presentation here and hand it over to Bruce Brown, one of the Communitech MedTech Growth Coaches, who's going to take us through the bulk of today's session.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to see so many people on the call. I guess that's a reflection of the amount of interest we've got in MedTech, and particularly the startups that are working in our region. A little bit about the session that we're going to have today. The reason we're holding this session is that the pathway to start and scale a MedTech company is unique in many ways. And there's a lot of things about starting or scaling a technology company in general that will not transfer easily into MedTech, or things about a MedTech space that are unique and don't present themselves in other areas. And the obvious one of those is regulatory, but it extends into other areas of channels and pricing and reimbursement and other things. So today's session is really intended for the startup or scale-up company that is in an early stage of doing all of that. So the answer to the question that Armin just asked, I see that most of you are in that prototyping stage. This is really kind of designed for you, where you have a prototype, you're working on a technology or a platform, you're aware that there's some special requirements in front of you around regulatory. You've probably become a little bit informed on all of that, but you haven't put together a really clear picture of the whole landscape. And so today is about trying to help create that clear picture of the overall landscape that's in front of you as a MedTech startup. For those of you who are further along, you might find that some of this content is a little too basic, but hopefully there's something in it for everybody. But we are trying to create sort of a broad horizontal view of what it means to be a MedTech company. And particularly in our region of Waterloo, many of our MedTech companies are born from engineering and move into MedTech, whereas some other centers, they're born from medical and move into technology. So what we mean by a MedTech company, how you define the MedTech space is up to debate and definition. There's no right answer here, but one of those first splits is it a regulated space or not regulated? Is it used in diagnostics, in monitoring and treatment, prevention or alleviation? From a category, is it a device? Or is it more bioscience like medicine, vaccine? Or is it software driven like systems for patient management? And then finally, one of the other segmentations is products and services and solutions that are restricted in their use to professionals versus those that are unrestricted or for general consumer use. And normally, our area is what you see in blue here. Could be any intended use, but mostly we work on the regulated side. And Peter and Paul and I are all experienced in devices, in MedTech devices, less so in software or information systems for medical, though obviously we would consider that part of the space. Okay, so what is it that makes MedTech different in the first place? It all stems from the fact that it is a controlled industry, that in every country, the government provides authority to some body that is responsible to regulate medical care, including medical devices. So in the US, that's the FDA. In Canada, it's Health Canada. In most parts of Europe, it's the EMA. But that regulatory body has authority to define requirements and to approve and control things that happen in the medtech space or in the medical space in general. And so they directly define device performance, how you have to test it, how you have to ensure the quality of it, how you can or cannot use it. And because they're defining that, it in turn creates unique business requirements around how long does it take to do this kind of stuff? What kind of skills am I going to need to do it? How am I allowed to sell my product and what's the price going to be? And it also affects who is interested in you as an investor. And so we're going to get into all of that just a little bit. Okay, so at the top of the food chain here is the idea that somebody is regulating and controlling and dictating things about the industry that you want to enter. And the FDA is the definitive example of that. It is, of course, just a US agency, but it has global influence on all of the other agencies, including Health Canada. The FDA or Health Canada, they all exist to ensure safety and efficacy and security for how a country or society goes about administering medicine from a private enterprise like you to its population. The FDA does lots of other things. There's a particular branch for medical devices called the Center for Devices and Radiological Health. And importantly, the FDA or Health Canada are not there to help you. They are there to protect the consumer, to protect the population by making sure that once a device reaches a marketplace, it is passed through their screening to have reasonable assurance that it's safe and effective in its intended use. And so the FDA and Health Canada are on the side of the greater population, not so much on the side of trying to help you succeed. Hopefully they act as a bridge, but in the end, they're really there to serve the public. Next slide, Armin. So let's start by talking about the process that you will need to go through to approve a medical device in the US. The process for Health Canada, by the way, is quite similar. The terminology changes, but usually if you're meeting the FDA, you are meeting the Health Canada requirements, but with different kinds of submissions. So the first step is classify the device. Is it a class 1, is it class 2, or a class 3? We're going to talk about that a little bit more. Then you've probably heard all kinds of terminology getting thrown around about class 2, 510K, what if you're de novo? The second step is within your class, you have to select a pre-market submission type, or it is selected for you. It's usually a pre-market approval, a pre-market notification, which is also known as your 510K, or a de novo, which means there's nothing else out there like you, but you are not a class 3. There are a couple of other exceptions for how you can get pre-market approval. And by pre-market approval, the FDA means before you get to market, you got to do this with us. So there's a couple of other exceptions which we'll touch on, but that's step 2. I've classified my device. I know if I'm 1, 2, or 3. Now I have to figure out how I submit my pre-market submission. Then we have to prepare the information for the submission itself, which includes not only what everybody thinks of, which is clinical validation, but you have submissions around your design control process, your manufacturing and delivery process, non-clinical testing, which is bench testing or verification, and the FDA or any other regulatory body, depending on what class you're in, will also control your communications, labeling, and broader than that. Once you've got all that done, you send it into the FDA. They come back and say, you're really good and you're good to go. And when you do that, you are assigned to a FURLS, FURLS, which is the FDA Unified Registration and Listing System. And you will be given a number that says you are now a approved or a cleared device. So let's get into all of how that happens, because it sounds like 5 easy steps, but they're not always that easy. So this first step of how do I know if I'm a class 1 or a class 2 or a class 3 device? A class 1 device is a low-risk device, and it goes as low as tongue depressors or beds. So, but interestingly, a tongue depressor is under the watch of the FDA or Health Canada. It's simply under the watch of a class 1 because its risk is low. That means that the FDA is going to have certain levels of control on your quality systems, on your markings, on your intended use, but you will be self-registered, self-monitored, and it is auditable by the FDA. The next level or class is the class 2, which is by far the most common for medical devices. Things that are, a blood pressure machine, a diagnostic system, imaging equipment, almost always fall under class 2. There will be controls that are general and special. They get into device tracking. How can we recall it? How are you explaining intended use in your communications? It usually requires a 510(k) submission. And usually that requires clinical trials. So I say usually, even though the number here says 25%. There are lots of times when you could submit to the FDA without having to go through clinical trials. But if your product is for human use, in other words, it's going to interact with humans as opposed to sanitize some equipment or be used for information. If it's in human use, it's going to be 510(k), and it's almost certainly going to include clinical trial. And then we get to the really risky stuff of class 3. Things like implants, pacemaker stents, robotic surgery fall into class 3. The bar around safety and effectiveness controls rises dramatically. And we'll try and quantify that, what that rise is for you in just a second. Clinical trials are always required, and the size and complexity of the clinical trial rise accordingly. So when you're first starting out, there's a very valid question. Am I class 1? Am I class 2? Am I class 3? That question is ultimately answered by the FDA in what's called a Q submission test. However, in advance of that, there's a really good searchable database that takes the 1,700 FDA product codes in 16 different categories. The link for it is right there. And it's pretty easy to zoom in on things that are like yours and get a pretty good idea if you're going to be class 1 or class 2. So if you're just starting out, that's normally where you would start out. You would start out with a self-search in this database to try and figure out if you're class 2 or 3. Once you've figured out, am I a class 1 or a class 2 or a class 3, the next thing is, what type or form of pre-market submission is going to be expected of me? So usually these line up. A class 2 product is usually a 510K. A class 3 product is usually a pre-market authorization, but not always. So let's just touch on them though. A 510K, which is known as a pre-market notification, is basically can exist when a predicate device exists and has been approved by the FDA. So if you are bringing out a new imaging machine for some certain type of tissue, and there are other imaging machines for the diagnosis of that tissue in existence, that other competitor can be deemed to be a predicate. And if a predicate exists, what changes is that you now need to prove safety, but only prove substantial equivalence compared to the predicate, not from scratch. The difference in class 3 or with a pre-market authorization is usually there is no predicate, there's nobody doing anything like you, and now you need to prove safety and effectiveness from ground zero. There is no comparator. You'll hear this terminology that if you are a 510K or a class 1 or 2, the FDA is going to clear you. They don't approve you, they clear you. And if you are a class 3 and likely a PMA, then the FDA is going to approve you. One of the other pre-market submissions that came into existence just like 30 years ago is called de novo. And de novo means there's no predicate for anything like you. No category exists for what you're doing, but we really don't see it as a super high risk. You're not doing an artificial heart. You are doing what appears to be a reasonable risk product. We just don't know what to use as a predicate. So in that case, you will go into a special stream called de novo. You will have to prove safety and effectiveness, but at a much lower level of rigor than a pre-market authorization for a class 3 device. So when you're done those 2 steps, you will start to think of yourself as, I'm a class 2 510K, or I am a class 3 PMA company, or I am a class 2 de novo company. And that puts you on a certain track that will define the work you have ahead of you, particularly in clinical trials and regulatory approval. I think in the interest of time, we won't get too far into this, but there are other ways to get allowed into the market, even if you don't get clearance or approved. And they are these. There is a thing called an IDE, an investigational device exemption. In Canada, it's called an ITA, investigational test authorization, that allows you to go out and work with researchers or in your own clinical trials with your product before it has been approved. You still have to get granted that by the regulatory body, but it is a temporary shortcut for the purpose of research. There are also categories under human called an HUD, where either very, very few people would ever use your device or technology because it's such a rare thing, or it's only going to be used in such grave conditions that there's little risk of downside of using your device. That's an HUD and an HDE. The one thing about regulatory affairs that, you know, if I could stress one thing for an early stage company is not to think of regulatory affairs or even an area of stuff we need to worry about. It is a function. It is a full function of a company. You will be in constant interaction with the FDA. It's not about gathering up the paperwork, sending it away. You are in negotiation constantly with the FDA to talk to them about different aspects of your testing, about how your specifications are coming along on your prototype. Are those specifications, if they're not meeting the predicate, is it clinically of consequence? So even in companies, I will give you an example of a company that I work for now, which is Keynote Health. It's a company of 28 people. It's a class 2 510K device that is going to be used for the diagnosis of allergies. We have a full-time director of regulatory affairs with deep expertise in working with the FDA. So this is not an area even for a small company. And by the way, that person became a member of our management team about 1.5 to 2 years before we were seeking, before our expected submission date. And so it's just one of those areas that will grow in importance and is not to be underestimated in terms of the time and the specific knowledge that it requires to do this well. Some companies choose to do it with third-party consultants, which is quite possible as well. And you'll have to, you know, you'll face that at some point. But I guess the main point is this is not about self-learning. You don't want to go into a MedTech class 2 or greater product and try and figure it out. It will cost you enormously and increase the risk of your company. And investors won't like it if you tell them that's what you're doing. Okay, so this is just a little summary of the pathway and decision tree that we just went through. As you go into a regulatory pathway, your pathway is first defined by the class you are in, then by the type of submission you need, 510K, de novo, HDE, and so on. That in turn defines what level of controls there will be on your company and what form of clinical data is required from your clinical trials. And then they turn into terminology where you either say, I'm cleared or I'm approved. And that last purple circle is the magic moment at which you get to go to market and start selling things. All of this takes a fair amount of time. So this information was gathered by Paul Weber, who's on the call, and it's about average of about 40 companies or so that we've got some knowledge of how long it took. The company will go through, your company is going to go through a research and discovery stage, which is working on all kinds of relevant stuff, but you wouldn't be able to write down a full product requirement yet. You're working on enabling technology and ideas. That can be anywhere from 1 to 3 years. And then you move into product development, which is, I know exactly what I'm trying to develop, now I need to do it. In the medical field, compared to other technology fields, at least I find, research and development is not one combined thing. There is a very distinct research phase followed by a very distinct development phase. And then you move into trials and regulatory, and then into manufacturing and eventually commercial launch. From your idea to revenue, the startup of your company to revenue is typically around 6 years. And all of this is if you're at that kind of class 2 510K device level of complexity. And so when you're in that early stage of research and discovery, we think of you at Communitech as a early stage startup. There are maybe 50, the number's actually bigger than I'm showing here. There's probably 50 to 70 of them in the region. Then you transition by expanding the number of functions in your company, by by looking for your first investment into, you go through a transitioning phase into a maturing startup, and then you reach first revenue, you go to scaling and then mature. We can add another dimension to that on the next slide.
Yeah, and Bruce, maybe at that point, I would just
sorry, yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
pull the, oh, sorry, let's do this one, and then I'm going to poll the participant what stage everybody is, thinks their company is at. So you can start thinking about that as Bruce explains a couple more aspects here.
Yeah. So this just adds a couple of more stages after first revenue, which is, okay, you get to first revenue and now you're in the market. To get to positive cash flow is normally another 3 years. You continue to spend a lot of money on continuing development, product line expansion, but mostly on go-to-market, expanding your distribution channels, moving into international markets, hiring sales forces. By the time you're past, when you get to first revenue, you will be spending significantly more on the commercial side of your business than you will on the development side of your business. And a MedTech company that is, you know, let's say hitting that $30, $40 million, $50 million range is probably still spending 12 to 14% of their revenue, maybe more, on research and development, but they'll be spending 20% plus on the commercial side of their business. So you will continue to dig a hole, you'll continue to need investors through 9 years of your life. Then you hit positive cash flow, and a typical exit, whether that's IPO or whatever, a typical mature exit is about 9 to 12 years. So it's a long cycle. I'm sorry, go ahead now, Armin, you were going to ask a question on the poll.
Yeah, we want to poll you once more. So if you still have Mentimeter open, then just go to the next question there. If you closed it, just open it again by going to menti.com and typing in this code at the top here, the 3931643. And we want to know what stage is your company at. If you close the Mentimeter and open it again, please just skip the first few questions that you already replied to, so we don't have the same answers twice. So what stage are you at? Early stage, where you're kind of researching, you have a technology that you're working on, but definitely not a product requirement yet, as Bruce was saying. Transitioning, where you start raising capital, really start working on that product or solution. Are you maybe maturing, where you're looking at bringing it to market, or even scaling, or mature, where you are fully commercialized? And if you're not entirely sure, give it your best guess. We're just looking to see where do you fall on this spectrum, and that'll help us support you better in the services that Communitech provides to MedTech startups and scale-ups. So we have responses coming in, and I will leave this open. You can still provide responses to this question, and then again, pause Menti afterwards. It will show a slide that says back to the presentation. We will have a couple more questions on there just at the end of the session. So maybe leave it open on your phone or on that second screen that you have going. And Bruce, I think we have probably about another 10 minutes for the remaining content, and then we'll open up for questions and answers.
Okay, great. Okay, so all of this requires a fair amount of investment. Because we have long timelines and a lot of structure and rigor, a typical MedTech device company startup will require between $15 and $25 million of investment to get to its first revenue, to get to FDA clearance, and 45 to 55 million to get to positive cash flow. And of course, you know, if we lined up 100 MedTech companies, there's variation, but in our experience, this is pretty representative. You know, like a lot of companies, if there's outliers which are obvious from the start, which could be less and shorter, and there are outliers that could be more and longer. But this is pretty typical kind of stuff for a device-oriented class 2 company. So it's a long haul. And because of the profile of the level of investment and the time frame of the investment, it attracts a unique group of investors. General tech investors aren't usually eager to invest in MedTech, but there are lots of MedTech investment companies, particularly in the US, that like the profile of this risk. Next slide. Clinical trials are a really important part of all of this. You know, if you're a class 2 device or class 3, class 2, you're focused on safety and are you as effective as the predicate? In class 3, it's much more involved. You have to prove safety and effectiveness without a comparative reference. Almost every company will go through at least 1 and more likely 2 rounds of feasibility or pilot studies, which you do on your own. Therefore, you're learning. Sometimes the FDA will tell you you need to do it, but there will be studies or clinical trials that are not part of your FDA submission. Then there are the pivotal studies, which is usually what we're talking about when we use the term clinical trials. It's the study that is part of your submission to the FDA. So way back 2 or 3 years before your intention to submit, you will have a meeting with the FDA called the Q submission test or the Q submission meeting, where you'll outline to them the kind of testing you think you'll need to do. It'll also cover, am I a class 2, am I a 510K, or am I de novo? But it will include what you think your clinical trials are going to look like. Then as you approach your clinical trial date and you're ready to go to field, you will submit to the FDA a detailed protocol, and they will give you an okay on it. They'll say, look, if you go and do this with these sites and this many sites and this sample under this kind of protocol with those kinds of organizations, we will accept that as data to substantiate your submission. That's the pivotal study. And a class 2 device, a pivotal study, it's a little bit all over the place, but a sample of 100 to 300 is normal, spread over 2 to 6 sites. It will usually require, as a Canadian company, it will usually require that some of those sites be in the US. A typical time is 3 months to data gathering. The companies that I've worked with have spent anywhere from $150,000 to $750,000 on that pivotal study. Class 3 devices, those higher risk ones where you're trying to prove your effectiveness, can easily be 10 times that level of cost and size and require, 9 months, a year, even more. So one of the big challenges in front of you is, I'm going to have to do these clinical trials. I need access to hospitals or clinics or wherever my customers are to do the trials with me, to take on that role of principal investigator and say, I'm going to implement this protocol and collect data for you that you can then use as your clinical trial data for FDA submission. The teaching hospitals in the US, many Canadian hospitals are set up to do this, but they don't do it out of the kindness of their heart. The biggest expense you'll incur in your trials is the price that they will charge you to do clinical trials. Again, even in a small company like the one I work with now at Keynote Health, we have a full-time doctor on staff who is our director of clinical affairs, writing the protocols, working with the various sites to get this done. So it's, again, not something that you do as a side job. It's a deep area of requirement and a big hurdle for you to get over. FDA and Health Canada also regulate your quality system. They don't do it by being prescriptive. They do in Europe, but not here. So the FDA defines what they expect from a quality system under a code of federal regulations that you see the number there, 820.3. In Europe, they use an ISO standard called 13485. The Health Canada and the FDA expectations are harmonized with the ISO 13485, but the audit process is separate and different. And the requirements of a medical technology company on a quality system are higher and more rigorous than they are in other companies. And they will, they'll cover everything from design and material control to your corrective and preventive action procedures, your equipment and facility control, your document and record keeping, all those kinds of things. And again, even in a modest sized company that's a year or two away from market, you will have a quality manager building a system that is moving you towards the compliance of a 13485 standard. Next slide. The FDA regulates what's called labeling for a class 2 device or a class 3 device, but labeling while it includes labels, can you identify the certain things in a certain way and is it a certain size, and can we trace things accordingly? Labeling also extends into any communication about intended use, which means all of your user manuals and things and instructions. And it includes what you say publicly about the benefit or a claim about what it does. So any public statements on your website, advertising, anything that you do, you can be regulated about what you're allowed to say once you're a regulated device. And the FDA brings all of that under a thing called labeling. One of the other things that goes on in MedTech is the need for scientific advisory. MedTech companies always have scientific advisory boards at some point. They're expected by your investors. It's because most of us who work in MedTech are not medical clinicians or researchers, and we need to have clear, obvious touch points as sources for market input into our decision-making and our product definition. And so people like Neil, who is on the call, are often members of companies' scientific advisory boards. It usually goes through a stage where a scientific advisor is associated with your company. They're a researcher that's involved in research to which your development is relevant. And they kind of get interested because they're curious and they're researchers by nature, and you have a relationship with them where they start to advise you. And over time, that formalizes into a scientific advisory board that has a charter, that has a variety of clinicians and researchers where you are meeting regularly and they are being paid for their participation. These people often become your key opinion leaders when you go to market. They often serve as pilot sites for your testing. And in many areas of MedTech, it is not necessarily just open market pricing because most MedTech devices are used in procedures that are reimbursed. So if we start with the idea that in the United States, there is Medicare and Medicaid, and they are willing to pay a certain amount for something to be done, the removal of a hangnail, that comes under a thing called a CPT code. And so when the doctor removes your hangnail, he issues a CPT code to Medicare or Medicaid or to the private insurer HMO and says, I just completed a CPT code XYZ, and Medicare goes, you get paid $82 to do that. And it's a well-established system that is administered by Medicare and Medicaid now. There are thousands of CPT codes, and they're used for everything from major surgery to minor diagnostics. And your company's device or solution, if it is part of a reimbursed procedure, let's say you come up with a machine that's better at removing hangnails, you need to do a lot of work to make sure that A, you are recognized at meeting the requirement for that CPT code, and B, that all the payers from Medicare and Medicaid through to all the HMOs agree with that. That they say, yeah, we think you have got a better solution. By the way, could you save us a little money while you're at it? And you get accepted through a very distributed, uncentralized process to be accepted as a for reimbursement. And if a CPT code does not exist for what you do, but your channel expects you to be reimbursed or to be reimbursed for using your solution, you have a very big job to try and get a new CPT code established, which takes a fair amount of time and effort. So that's sort of, this is just to summarize all of that. It's just, med tech companies like you that are starting up, there are unique challenges to what's in front of you, things that are only occurring in med tech. And they include they start with regulatory, but you have to navigate the complexity of that. It drives clinical trials, connection to the medical community, a special breed of investors, restriction on the channels and who can use your product, restrictions on pricing and reimbursement because you're in a public and private paid controlled system, your quality management system, and your labeling and communications are all affected. So when you're starting out, this is what Peter, Paul, Neil, myself helped companies with in the early stages of trying to sort out some of these things. We try and give you a bit of information and point you in the right direction on some of these things as your company grows and faces these new challenges. So, and I think that's it. Is it, Armin?
Yeah.
My last slide.
Thank you, Bruce. Fantastic. So lots of information in a pretty condensed format. And we'll upload the session so you can always rewatch it. But at this point, we want to do two things. We want to open it up for questions. And I know some of you also already submitted questions when you signed up. So we'll make sure to bring those up. But you can also now type your questions into the chat. And then also I would like to direct you back in parallel to menti.com, where you can fill in some of the next areas that, again, help us better serve all of you as a community of medtech companies and you individually when you reach out to myself or any of my colleagues. So you can, in this next question here, tell us what area you would like support with or you could use support with. If you pick other, there is a follow-up that asks you to specify that. And then also we're asking, you can fill that in at the end, maybe before you'll leave, just saying, would you like to see more sessions like this one? And also this very last one, where I'm not going to show the results, but we're going to look at it afterwards, is how you liked the session. Was this time well spent? What do you think? And there is also a question in there, if you had 3 wishes on services or offerings that Communitech could offer to your company, to you as a founder, plug them in here. We're going to look at that afterwards to see how can we further improve our service offering. But with that, I'm going to head over to the questions here. So some of the questions that we also had come in already when people signed up were, for example, how did you get your first customer or pilot? And maybe, Neil, that's one that I would like to throw your way, because in some ways, getting a first customer or pilot often involves getting access to a clinician and starting to understand their context. Can you maybe tell us a little bit more about what a company would typically do when they first touch base with someone like you, a physician, in their respective field, and what are some of the things that they can do to position themselves as an attractive partner for some sort of advisory or collaboration with that physician?
Awesome. Yeah, great question. I'd say first off, usually people who come and connect with me, whether that's a little bit unethical, but a patient of mine who has a great idea and they want to pitch it to me in the middle of their examination, which is a bit awkward, or in other ways, their own network will know of me and then they'll pitch it towards me as well. That's one way. Also be aware that there are a lot of physicians around that go to pitch funds, to these AMA sessions, where they want to learn more about companies, where they do want to help out. One of the biggest attractions of being in the KW area is the MedTech sector. So there are physicians around that are looking to, one, either pilot a product, or two, advise on a product. The key part is knowing your why. If you know why you're doing something and how you can bring that back to why it's helping the community, then you're more likely to convince a clinician that this is something they should spend their time helping you with. Without that why, it just seems like you're in it for yourself.
Awesome, thank you, Neil. And then looking at the chat here, and I'll also read out more questions still from the sign up, but Darren is asking, do data systems that help pharmacies manage their patients fall under needing FDA approval? So Darren, I think there we would direct you initially to that link that Bruce shared on one of the slides to search the FDA database, right? I don't know if we would know off the top of our heads, but if you go there and do a research, you might already find your answer. And if you don't, feel free to come back to us and we can see how we can help you further. Jason is asking, with regard to the typical investment required portion, is the 45 to 55 million investment until revenue additional to the initial 10 to 15 million, or would it typically be cumulative? So I think it's cumulative, but I'm going to throw it over to Peter here, who has done a lot of fundraising for the MedTech companies he's been involved with. And maybe, Peter, you can tell us a little bit more about how much needs to be raised, whether this is a cumulative number, and also a bit more about how to go about fundraising from MedTech investors.
Sure. So the 45 to 55 is cumulative, and it's a very broad range because the number varies significantly depending on the company, how long it takes to develop the technology and the FDA approval process. So it does vary a lot. In terms of how to go about it, I think initially companies raise money from families, from friends, and then from there tend to go to angels and start looking at home offices of wealthy individuals. And then subsequent to that, once they become more sophisticated, and usually once they've started generating revenues, you can go towards the venture capital companies. Those are mainly in the US. There's not a lot of MedTech investors in Canada. And then, as the companies grow, many of them do go public. So that's kind of the last level of accessing funding.
Awesome, thank you. Another question we had during sign up was, what steps should a company take to start manufacturing? Paul, maybe I can hand this one over to you.
Yeah, typically, from a manufacturing, that's when you're getting much down the line and so on. It really depends on what, there's going to be some strategic decisions on whether you're doing that in-house. Many of us, in my experience, tend to do it out of house and partnering with an outsourced manufacturing group. And so it's a process of handing that over the wall from your engineering team and so on. And generally does take, in our experience, a significant, it's not an easy process to pass that over. Takes funding to do that. Might take $500,000 in funding to transition that over to a quality controlled manufacturing process. I'm not sure if I'm answering that question exactly, but again, it's going to be very dependent on the company.
The person who asked that question, when you sign up, if you want to ask a follow-up, feel free to just put it into the chat here. In the meantime, Ashley is asking, at what stage should a full-time quality role be brought on versus working with consultants or advisors? So Bruce, I know you kind of alluded to, you could go either way, right? Bring consultants in or a full-time person. Can you maybe shine a little bit more light on what sort of an ideal pathway might look like?
Yeah, and so I would just say that the 2 or 3 companies that I have been directly involved with in the last few years have had a quality manager as part of their management team on a full-time employee basis from about two years or a little bit more than 2 years prior to FDA submission. So if you believe that you're heading towards a product submission of the January 1st, 2024, and you want to be in market by mid 2024, I would say that that person needs to come on at the beginning of 2022. I'm sure there are other ways to do it with consultants and so on, but the depth of detail in the system, it needs a person who is feeding that system and expanding the documentation and keeping the records on such a real-time basis that, at least for me, it would seem to be that it is first and foremost an employee position, not a consulting position. If the employee is new or less experienced in 13485 or MedTech quality systems, then you'd bring in a consultant to help set up the system and guide it. But I don't think you can shortcut it and not have the person. Peter or Paul, any comments on that?
I would agree with you, Bruce. It's about 2 years beforehand. You can use consultants, but it's much easier to have an internal person to work with.
Excellent, thank you. We also had a question during sign up. Any tips on getting products covered by Medicare Advantage programs? I know Bruce already spoke a bit more broadly about the reimbursement codes. I don't know if you or one of the other guys can comment on the Medicare Advantage program.
The only comment that I'd make is that if in a case where you do not have, it's always beneficial and an easier path in the market where you have reimbursement codes, that's important. In a case where you don't, just to give an expectation, it generally takes about 5 peer-reviewed studies in the market, which typically happen post-approval. So it's a multi-year process to build that data. You need very, very deep experience to put together that plan in order to execute that, and also engagement with the different reimbursement groups and third-party payers to make sure that you're providing the details that are going to successfully get that reimbursement.
Yeah. Thank you. And so reimbursement, of course, is the financial side of things with the FDA. Neil, from a physician's perspective, if you come across a great new innovation, what are some of the things that make you consider a new solution versus the established way?
Sorry, could you repeat that? My apologies.
What are some of the aspects that make you consider a new solution versus what you currently have in place when an innovative solution comes along?
Does it help the patient? Does it help me? And can I save money with it? Are the big 3. In terms of priority, that's usually order. Patient comes first for me. But that last one about does it save me money is key, because if it helps the patient or helps me but is exorbitantly expensive, I'd rather just do it in my manual process rather than keep going, which is not really a barrier, because then instead of going through a family physician, see how you can apply that technology directly to the consumer instead. Because just because I'm not going to implement it doesn't mean a patient wouldn't pay for it.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. So there's different aspects. So obviously the FDA or Health Canada, a key partner you need to focus on, but also very important to get that validation from a physician or someone else in the clinical space to understand, is this something they would actually use, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
One of the biggest things that we find incredibly annoying is we see all these great products that are coming out, and it was a thing about 5 years ago, still kind of is there are usually cloud-based solutions where we're seeing either hardware or software collecting information about a patient, but it requires a different login and nothing's integrated. And so if I need to log into 10 different programs just to get information to be collected, I'm not going to do it, because at that point, it doesn't save me time. And because it's not integrated, does it really help me for the patient? And that's the balance that I end up looking at is it beneficial to my patient, or is it just nice to have? And if I have to make that decision because of a lack of integration or a lack of value, there's more of a chance I'm not going to integrate something. And I'm one of the earlier adopters of new technology as well.
That's a great point, Neil. So it's not just about your solution being great on its own. It really has to fit into the workflow. So that's something to consider. And as we're coming up to the end of our time here, there is one more question that I'm going to refer to. And then, like I said, I would like to ask everybody that before you leave, you still head over to Menti one more time and fill in how you like the session, and are there any other topics on which you would like to see sessions. That is really going to inform how we move forward with this part of our programming. So the question from John here is, what is the overarching strategy for the region of Waterloo and Communitech that you are seeing as it relates to MedTech for 2021? And what significant changes have you seen recently? So we definitely see MedTech as a significant vertical. We have around about 10% of new companies that are coming to Communitech being either MedTech or MedTech adjacent. Sometimes it's even more than that. So it's a significant vertical, significant sector. And we are looking at bolstering up our programming there. So there is a couple of things in the works. And by the time you watch this video online as a recording, there might already be more information. So to both the people on the call here today and the ones who might be watching this video afterwards, I would suggest connect with your advisor or CSM if you have one. If you don't, reach out to us through our general contact form or reach out to myself and see what we can do for you. We're here to help MedTech startups grow and succeed. And with that, I want to really thank Neil, Bruce, Paul, and Peter for their time today. And I want to thank all of you who listened in and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thanks very much for seeing you here. And again, reach out anytime if you think we can help you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.